My name is Scott Ludlam. I am your MC this morning. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm just going to run through a couple of housekeeping items and then we'll get started proper. But the first thing I want to say is thanks for being with us. Of all the other places that you could be, you've chosen to be with us and we really appreciate it. So, welcome to the second or third, depending on how you count them, webinar hosted by Don't Nuke the Climate. We're really glad that you're here with us. Just going over some housekeeping things. We're going to keep this to a tight hour for the presentations and then run a half-hour optional Q&A session. And in the middle of that, we're going to ask for your feedback on a couple of things that'll become clearer as we run. We're keeping folks' mics muted, and there's a fairly restricted chat as well, and that's mainly for the respect of our speakers. But we would like your feedback. This is going to be interactive. We're really keen on your questions that we can put to the panel. We're also keen a bit later in the show for your ideas, for your campaign ideas and things that you've noticed in the course of how this debate's running. A lot has been happening even since, for some of the folk who might have been on one of our previous calls, 7 Communities Regional Alliance has formed. Peter Dutton has continued to press this doomed idea of nuclear power all over Australia. There's a lot happening and we're just really pleased to be able to keep these things running. So we're going to keep this conversation respectful and a safe place to exchange ideas and questions. And on that note, there are no silly questions. So some people are coming into this issue pretty fresh. And we're joined today by people who've been working on nuclear energy and nuclear issues more broadly literally for decades. So this is for information exchange, sharing, and learning. So I'd like to acknowledge that wherever we are today, we're on stolen ground. We're on sovereign country. I'm speaking from the traditional country, the Yuin people on the south coast of New South Wales. And I want to pay my respects to elders past and present, and all the warriors and custodians who took care of this country since time immemorial, and to extend that to any First Nations people who are with us today. I just also like to present who's hosting this call. This is Don't Nuke the Climate, in collaboration with the Australian Conservation Foundation, Friends of the Earth, or the Nuclear Free Collective in particular, and Nuclear Free Western Australia. We're launching the campaign, which is offering resources and facts to counter the disinfo that's being spread by the coalition, the Murdoch media, and the nuclear industry in turn. And what we're really trying to do here is build a movement. Everyone who cares about this planet, who cares about the climate, who cares about the renewable energy transition, who cares about land rights, needs to be an anti-nuclear activist, at least for now until the next election. We'll take you for longer, but if all we've got you for is the next 8 or 9 months, if you care about any of these things, we need you to block and stop and challenge this nuclear push. And we can do it. I strongly believe we can do it. We've got the expertise and the resources, and we've got the arguments, and that's what today is about. So our special guests today, Trish Frail, Dave Sweeney, Jim Green, Wendy Farmer, and Senator Svart, and I'll introduce each of those folk as we come to the speakers. Dear Auntie Sue Hasseldine, unfortunately, was unable to be with us today. She's had she's unwell at the last minute. But we're really proud and honoured that we've got Trish Frail, who's the co-chair of the Australian Nuclear Free Alliance, to join us and jump in at the last minute. So thanks, Trish. And we'll introduce everybody as we go. So Dave Sweeney is our first speaker. He's been active in mining, resources and nuclear issues for 4 decades. Through his work with the media, trade unions and environment groups, he presently leads the Australian Conservation Foundation's Nuclear Free campaign. He's a co-founder of the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons, which means our first speaker today is a Nobel Peace Prize winner. Dave Sweeney, please go ahead.
Thank you very much, Scott, and good morning, everybody, and thanks for joining us today. Like Scott said, my name's Dave Sweeney. I work with ACF, and I'm based in Naarm in Melbourne on Wurundjeri and Kulin Nations land. And I'd like to also give a shout out to them and to the owners of the country where you are listening and living on. And this is important, not just as a mark of respect, but also, and especially given today's topic, as a mark of recognition, because First Nations people here and around the world have borne a heavy burden from the impacts of the nuclear industry, whether that's uranium extraction, waste dump plans, or nuclear weapons testing. And all of these have and continue to adversely impact First Nations country and communities. It's also important to note, though, that along with feeling the impact, First Nations people are leading the resistance to nuclear projects. And that resistance is spirited, it's sustained, and it's often successful. And in the last year, the Bungala people in South Australia's Eyre Peninsula have defeated a Morrison government plan to locate radioactive waste on their country against their will. In the last week, after decades of defence and defiance, the Mirarr people of Kakadu have ended plans for uranium mining at Jabiluka. And I want to acknowledge their efforts and the efforts of all resistors of radioactive risk, and we should take heart and we should take lessons from them in our struggle ahead of the next federal election. So the next federal election has been called by both major parties a referendum on nuclear power. So today I'd like to talk briefly about what we know, what we don't, and what's at stake in the nuclear debate. So in mid-June, opposition leader Peter Dutton turned half-baked chatter into a reckless push when he fully embraced the option of domestic nuclear power. A coalition government would seek to fast-track the construction of nuclear reactors at 7 sites of former or closing coal-powered stations in Victoria, Western Australia, South Australia, New South Wales and Queensland. Note, though, they never asked the owners and they never asked those communities. The coalition has also, this week, expressed formal support for a wider nuclear industry, for more uranium mining, for uranium enrichment and fuel fabrication, costly, contaminating and proliferation-sensitive nuclear trades. These are all now firmly on the coalition's list of atomic ambitions. And there is growing talk of a coalition Australia hosting the world's high-level radioactive waste, some sort of radioactive terra nullius for forever poison that needs isolation for 100,000 years, and which no country in the world has sorted or effectively disposed of, despite 70 years of nuclear power operations and multiple billions of dollars worth of flawed, frustrated and failed attempts. So that's what we know. The coalition want Australia to be a fully nuclearised nation, from contaminated cradle to early grave. But there's a lot that we do not know. They say the devil is in the detail, and when it comes to Peter Dutton's nuclear push, Beelzebub is completely missing in action. We do not know how many reactors or what sort of reactors. We do not know who would build or operate or maintain these reactors. We do not know what proportion of Australia's future energy mix would be supplied by nuclear power. We do not know the regulatory, licensing, insurance regimes. We do not know how much water they need or where that would come from. We do not know what or where would happen to the waste. And that's just the start. There is lots more that we don't know. It's an extraordinary lack of detail for a move with such massive intergenerational consequences. Now, Peter Dutton and Ted O'Brien routinely call for a mature conversation and an adult debate about nuclear power, yet all they give us is sound bites and adjectives. There is compelling evidence that nuclear power is simply not fit for purpose in Australia, as Dr. Jim Green will soon demonstrate. It's simply the most expensive and slowest option for generating electricity in this country. But the coalition is ignoring the evidence and drinking deep from the cooling pond and the Kool-Aid of nuclear enthusiasm. But fortunately, not everybody is sharing that. The coalition's push faces many critics: community voices and civil society voices, the National Environment Movement, First Nation, Climate Council, public health, trade union voices, and more. And it also faces critique or active opposition from less traditional critics of nuclear, including the energy utilities and providers, the people and the companies who generate, transmit and provide Australia's electricity, and AEMO, the Australian Energy Market Operator. It faces opposition from the states, none of whom were asked or invited, all of whom oppose, and have state laws or policies against nuclear power, and that includes state opposition Conservative parties. It faces opposition or concern from energy funders and financiers who don't like the uncertainty, the time delay, the cost blowout, and that includes our super funds. It faces opposition or concern from the heavyweights of the Australian scientific community, CSIRO, and the Australian Academy of Science and Engineering. It's a strong list. If you see their comments, hear their concerns, look at their sums, the nuclear power push should be over by lunchtime. But sadly, it won't be. The coalition is locked onto nuclear, not as a good faith option to replacing coal, most of which will be gone in 10 years, all of which will be gone in 15, or are they doing this to advance climate action? It's quite the opposite. The coalition move is an ad hoc, chaotic, contradictory political fix that seeks to unite a disparate coalition from tech enthusiast liberals to renewable phobic nationals. It seeks to cover up a decade of denial and inaction on climate and indeed on advancing nuclear while they were in government. It seeks to wedge Labor, especially around AUKUS, and it seeks to harness a Trump-style cost of living and site-specific renewable concern into a voice-style disaffection and resentment vote, an atomic Brexit with limited or no connection to reality, evidence, or truth. And above all, it seeks to cement fossil fuels in Australia's energy future by delaying and derailing the essential and happening rollout of renewable energy. It is the direct opposite of what is needed to address our pressing climate and energy challenges. If advanced, the coalition plans means energy and economic uncertainty and climate chaos. It is deeply flawed, reckless, and utterly irresponsible approach that needs to be contested and defeated. So we have a task ahead. We need to demand detail, voice opposition, promote the renewable and far superior alternatives. And we need to counter, without getting distracted or disheartened, the misinformation and malice of some nuclear proponents on social media and elsewhere. So we have a task, but as Scott said, we also have the tools. We have solid evidence and arguments, economic, environmental, independently verified. We have the growing performance of renewables. 100% of Tassie, 100% of the ACT, 75% of SA, and currently 40% of all electricity in this country is provided today by renewables, and that is growing. We have strong and diverse allies and powerful political and institutional support. And above all, we have people. People that want a secure, safe, clean, responsible future, not ever-increasing nuclear risk. And people power is both far safer and stronger than nuclear power. So thanks for your concern and your efforts and whatever brought you to this room today and for what you do tomorrow and going forward. And I look forward to working with you over the coming months to outline and achieve a better nuclear-free vision for our country. Thank you.
Hey, that's brilliant, Dave. Thank you so much. And for everything that you've done in those 40 years to keep this place nuclear-free. Noticing that a couple of questions are starting to trickle into the Q&A. Please keep them coming. The Q&A session after this main presentation by our incredible speakers is optional. We're just basically saying half an hour for chat, for Q&A, and for feedback on the work that we're all doing. So please keep those coming. Our next speaker, Trish Frail, is an Agamba woman from Barrawarrina. Trish has worked in the social justice areas in her community on local, state, national and the global level, specialising in domestic violence, in homelessness and community development. She's a business owner. She's fought in her local community against a proposed nuclear waste dump. She's also been the co-chair of the incredible Aboriginal-led Australian Nuclear Free Alliance, so that's ANFA, for the past couple of years. So fresh from protecting her country from the imposition of the nuclear industry, please welcome Trish, and thank you for joining us at such short notice. Please tell us a little bit about your work stopping a radioactive waste dump on country and your time with the Australian Nuclear Free Alliance. Please welcome Trish.
Okay, thanks everyone. So I was just going to talk a little bit about uranium, nuclear and waste and how it affects First Nations people and our country. So no bunda bunda on Nambar land. My local council, for Warren Shire Council, wanted to build a nuclear waste dump on the Nambar land, which this land also happens to have the oldest man-made structure in the world, and it's called Bayami Mungas, which are the fish traps. I commenced a campaign to stop it, and I won. It was the quickest successful anti-nuclear campaign in the world. I called my campaign No Bunda Bunda on Nambar land. Bunda Bunda means bad poison. After I was successful with that campaign, I then thought, I'm going to get onto my local council so nothing like this ever happens again. I ran another campaign and I was successful. I'm now a councillor at Warren Shire Council. I then became a member of ANFA and I'm now a co-convener. I'm also a member of the Greens. I never knew anything about ANFA until they got in touch with me, having seen my campaigns on Facebook. So I really did use a lot of social media and I was successful. We all know how devastating uranium is to our culture by our lived experience of mining, weapons, and waste. Our lived experiences are our song lines, which you would know as boundaries. All the borders, all the boundaries, they take uranium into account, and our dreaming stories tell us the dangers of uranium. First Nations people had lived the horrific experience of the effects and aftermath of mining, weapons, waste, and we continue to do so. Our communities were never consulted when their land was mined, nor had they been compensated with it. They were not consulted when they were used as guinea pigs at the Maralinga and at other places. Family members are still suffering their health-wise and culture-wise, and that area, the Maralinga area, was not a desert area, as the government claimed and that the British government also claimed. The cultural foundation principles. When you look up in the sky, you'll see the Southern Cross, but in our language, it's called the Yarrandu. It's the foundation of our law, which means respect, which is the boomerang, responsibility, which is a stone axe, justice, which is a spear, discipline, which is a stone knife, and the little star you see, that is your home. For 65,000 years, we have been following the foundations of our principles of culture, yet our knowledge of uranium has never been taken into account. All clans who have uranium on their land, they have that knowledge of the dangers of the uranium, yet they have their own stories and their own dances regarding the dangers, yet they have never been spoken to about it. Now with the mining, waste and weapons, our culture is suffering. The poison from the mines, weapons and waste clans have to move off. The clans have to move off their traditional lands, and generations afterwards, they can still not go onto their land. We are saying no. I'm amazed with all the scientific evidence and the dangers of uranium, nuclear, and we are not forgetting about the ways that the government wants to still pretend that that's the way to go. To Dutton and all the other political parties, we say no. We need your support to stop this from happening. Help us to continue to live another 65,000 plus years. So And I also didn't acknowledge that I'm not on country, and I do acknowledge that I'm on the Darug people's land, and all the other countries that everyone's listening to from. So, and that's all I needed to say.
Thank you so much, Trish. That was absolutely mesmerizing. Thank you for sharing the story, particularly the Southern Cross story, and the stories of how people knew, didn't have Geiger counters, didn't have scientific textbooks, knew the uranium was on that country and knew to avoid it. And I think it's pretty safe to say that the anti-nuclear movement in Australia would not exist without First Nations leadership. And it certainly wouldn't have had the incredible successes that we've had over the last 40 years without your leadership. So thank you for sharing that with us today. That's just fantastic.
Thanks,
We're going to
Scott.
move across the country a little way.
So I was just going to talk a little bit about uranium, nuclear and waste and how it affects First Nations people and our country. So no bunda bunda on Nambar land.
So I'm going to invite Dr. Jim Green. Jim is the National Nuclear Free Campaigner with Friends of the Earth Australia. He's a member of the Nuclear Consulting Group. He's also the former editor of the Nuclear Monitor newsletter published by the World Information Service on Energy and the Nuclear Information and Resource Service, which are both incredible long-term resources on this issue. Jim's got an honours degree in public health, a doctorate in science and technology studies for his thesis on the debates over the replacement of Australia's nuclear research reactor. Jim has been at this campaign for as long as anybody on the call, and he's assembled a really important and valuable resource for anybody who's trying to come to grips with the breadth of this issue. Dr. Jim Green, please take it away.
Thanks, Scott, and thanks everyone for joining in. And I'd like to acknowledge the Kaurna traditional owners here in South Australia, in Adelaide, and their ongoing struggle for sovereignty. So I'm going to run through a 15-minute PowerPoint presentation. Hopefully you can see that on your screen now. There's a lot of information in this PowerPoint, so I would encourage people to download the PowerPoint. Also, I'll refer to a lot of articles and reports, and those are linked in this PowerPoint, so just download the PowerPoint to follow the links. It's important to put Australia's debate in some international context. In a nutshell, the industry is in a disastrous state around the world, and we shouldn't expect any better outcomes here in Australia. Nuclear power's contribution to global electricity generation is barely half what it was at its historic peak. Conversely, renewables have grown strongly and now account for 30.2% of global electricity generation, and the IEA expects that to reach 42% by 2028. And you can see on that graph that there's very strong growth for renewables and a slow and steady decline for nuclear. And there are three main reasons here. One is the massive cost reductions for renewables and also for storage systems such as batteries. The second is the massive cost increase for nuclear power. And the third is the legacy of the Fukushima disaster in Japan in 2011. A bit more international context. In the United States, construction of 2 reactors in South Carolina was abandoned in 2017 after the expenditure of $13.6 billion, and Westinghouse then filed for bankruptcy. That left just one remaining construction project in the US. That was in the state of Georgia. It was recently completed, but at an astronomical cost of $25.7 billion per reactor. And oddly, the Dutton Coalition is now promoting these AP1000 reactors. And so now there are no reactors at all under construction in the United States. We're being told that there's a nuclear power renaissance going on, but that simply doesn't match the facts. In Australia's other AUKUS partner, the United Kingdom, there's just one construction project. It's in Somerset. It comprises 2 EPR reactors, and the latest cost estimate is $43.5 billion per reactor. And if we look at both the US and the UK, the most recent cost estimates are more than 10 times greater than the early estimates. So keep that in mind when Dutton releases the Coalition's nuclear cost estimates. It's likely to be out by a very, very wide margin. I mentioned South Korea briefly because South Korea has been promoted as a potential supplier of reactors to Australia. Unfortunately, the South Korean nuclear industry is riddled with corruption, and its APR 1400 reactors have been likened to a car without airbags and safety belts. China is the one and only country in the world with a significant nuclear expansion program, but it pales in comparison to the growth of renewables, and that was starkly demonstrated last year when there was 1 gigawatt of new nuclear capacity compared to 278 gigawatts of new renewable capacity. So the Coalition's nuclear plan in Australia, reactors at 7 closed or soon to be closed coal power sites. These sites could host 1 or more reactors, non-existent small modular reactors in SA and WA, and larger reactors in the eastern states. Government funded because industry wouldn't touch this with a barge pole. First reactors operating in the mid-2030s, but in reality, they couldn't begin operating until the mid-2040s at the absolute earliest. If realised, these reactors might produce about 10% of Australia's electricity demand by 2050, give or take. There's a lot of uncertainty surrounding this project, so 10% is a rough estimate at best. Anyway, I make that point because nuclear power is being sold as a silver bullet, but at best it could make a modest contribution to Australia's electricity generation. Could a coalition government deliver on its nuclear proposals? Yes, it could use taxpayer funds. Yes, a coalition government could override opposition from state governments. Yes, a coalition government could use compulsory acquisition laws to acquire the coal power sites from the current owners. Yes, a coalition government could override opposition from local communities, as it has already threatened to do, and opposition from First Nations communities. One obstacle might be the Senate. A coalition government would need to get legislation through the Senate, and it might be blocked. We can't be certain of that, but there's certainly a strong possibility that would occur. The coalition's policies would result in a massive increase in greenhouse gas emissions. If it was a good faith policy, nuclear plus renewables, then renewables would necessarily do the heavy lifting, and nuclear's contribution would be to slow the transition, to make it more expensive and to make it more dangerous. But we need to be very clear, this is not a good faith policy to reduce greenhouse emissions. The Dutton Coalition wants to prolong the life of coal plants and probably build new coal plants, and to massively increase the use of gas, which currently accounts for just 4.8% of electricity generation in the national electricity market. And as Malcolm Turnbull says, the climate science denying element in the coalition is, quote, crazy and to some extent getting crazier, end quote. And that's the fundamental problem we have, is that the coalition has been in denial about climate science for several decades now, and there's no sign of that problem being resolved. There are absolutely divisions within the coalition. We should be clear about that. There are important divisions, but there's still this fundamental problem of a leadership which is in denial about climate science. If it seems like a strong accusation to be saying that the Dutton Coalition wants to derail the renewable energy transition, well, there's an abundance of evidence to support that assertion. The coalition plans to abandon the current target of 82% renewables by 2030, opposes the target to cut emissions by 43% by 2030, plans to rip up contracts signed by the Commonwealth in its capacity investment scheme. The Nationals are calling for a moratorium on the rollout of large-scale renewables. The coalition will withdraw Australia's pledge at the 2023 COP28 climate conference to triple renewables and double the rate of energy efficiency by 2030. The coalition would sign Australia up to a COP28 pledge to triple nuclear power by 2050. Queensland Senator Matt Canavan says the coalition intends to shut down the Climate Change Authority. And we should keep in mind some of the history here. The Abbott Coalition government defunded the Climate Commission and tried but failed to kill off the Climate Change Authority and the Australian Renewable Energy Agency. So these policies would result in a huge increase in emissions for two reasons. Firstly, the coalition would slow the growth of renewables, which would necessarily involve more fossil fuels and therefore greater greenhouse emissions. Secondly, this timing problem with the coal to nuclear proposals. Coal plants will be shut down in the next 10 to 15 years, but nuclear reactors could not begin operating until at least 20 years from now. And bridging that gap would necessarily involve fossil fuels. And these arguments are supported by any number of scientists and academics. CSIRO says that nuclear won't be able to make a meaningful contribution to achieving net zero emissions by 2050. Academics George Wilkenfeld and Clive Hamilton say the coalition's nuclear strategy would increase Australia's cumulative emissions over the period to 2050 by at least 1,462 million tonnes of carbon dioxide equivalent. An analysis by Solutions for Climate Australia finds that pursuing nuclear reactors would result in an additional 2.3 billion tonnes of greenhouse emissions. A report by Bloomberg New Energy Finance finds that nuclear power would result in higher electricity costs and would sound the death knell for decarbonisation efforts if it distracts from renewable investments. And a UTS academic says that the negative impact on Australia's carbon emissions would be huge, possibly leading to a 40% blowout in Australia's carbon budget. And a reminder that if you want to read these reports and these articles, download the PowerPoint and you can simply click on the links. What do scientists say? Australia's chief scientist, Cathy Foley, says nuclear is expensive and would take some time to build up the capability to introduce it. Former chief scientist Alan Finkel says that nuclear power is too slow and too expensive. Another former chief scientist, Robin Batterham, says that to reduce renewables in the belief that nuclear will be deployed later at scale would create a material risk of not achieving net zero or doing so at an excessive cost. New South Wales chief scientist Hugh Durrant-White, who played an important role in the British nuclear program, he says that it would be naive to think nuclear could be introduced in less than 2 decades. CSIRO says that nuclear does not provide an economically competitive solution in Australia and could not be deployed within the timeframe required. The Climate Council says that nuclear power plants are not appropriate for Australia and never will be, and nuclear is expensive, illegal, dangerous, and decades away. And a report by ATSI, the Academy of Technological Sciences and Engineering, notes that no small modular reactors exist in any OECD countries, and the technology is unproven technically and financially. So nuclear power is simply too slow. It would necessitate at least 10 years for licensing and planning, at least 10 years for construction, or around 10 years for construction, and an estimated 6.5 years, give or take, to repay the energy and carbon debts. So nuclear power couldn't contribute to greenhouse emissions reductions until 2050 at the earliest. And there are plenty of overseas examples of extremely long planning and construction timelines. And the coalition's claim that reactors could be operating by the mid-2030s is nonsense. Dr. Alan Finkel says any call to go directly from coal to nuclear is effectively a call to delay decarbonisation of our electricity system by 20 years. Nuclear power is too expensive, and I'll very quickly run through some relevant reports here. The ACF Power Games report finds that nuclear costs would need to come down by 2/3 to be competitive with renewables coupled with storage. And there is absolutely no chance whatsoever of nuclear costs coming down by 2/3. The ACF report finds that replacing Australia's 21.3 gigawatts of coal capacity would cost at least $500 billion. A report for the Clean Energy Council by Aegis, a leading consulting firm, finds that nuclear power is up to 6 times more expensive than renewables. An article by economists in the Australian Financial Review states that even if all that mattered was the cheapest possible energy that meets minimum levels of reliability and emissions, the coalition's plan fails. Annual household bills could increase by $1,000 or thereabouts under the Coalition's plan. Keep in mind that there's still a lot that has not been released about the Coalition's plan, so everyone's doing their best to pull together the best possible assessments with limited information. An article by Tim Buckley and Anne-Marie Johnson, it beggars belief that the alternative government proposes nationalising an uncosted nuclear debt bomb and detonating it at the heart of domestic energy and climate policy. And they estimate the fiscal damage at $100 billion, but likely considerably more. And the Smart Energy Council estimates costs of anywhere from $116 billion to $600 billion. The reason for that vast gap between those two estimates is, again, because we simply don't know what the Coalition is actually planning. CSIRO's Gen Cost report is very important, and it's the best available comparative analysis. And you can see there that the costs of nuclear, whether it's large or small nuclear, are far in excess of the cost of firmed renewables, in particular the cost of 90% wind and solar PV supplied to the national electricity market, including storage and transmission costs. Just a few comments on SMRs, small modular reactors, and we don't need any more than a few comments because they simply don't exist. The definition is that they have a capacity of less than 300 megawatts, whereas a conventional nuclear reactor has a capacity of about 1,000 megawatts. The modular term refers to serial factory production of reactor components, which could potentially drive down costs. There are said to be 2 SMRs operating in the world, one in China and one in Russia, but they were not produced using modular construction techniques, and there are no plans to mass produce more of these using modular construction techniques, so they couldn't even be called prototype SMRs. And basically, SMRs don't exist in China or Russia or anywhere in the world. And there are many failed SMR projects, the most recent and spectacular of which was the collapse of NuScale's proposal for a project in Idaho after the costs rose to a ridiculous $14 billion. Now, I want to sum up here. We're not going to go into nuclear risks in any detail. Nuclear power is too slow, it's too expensive, it's unnecessary. If there was an argument for nuclear, then we would need to carry out a serious considered risk-benefit analysis and consider these risks in detail, but we don't. Nuclear simply doesn't cut the mustard on economic grounds or timeliness grounds. But nevertheless, it's important to remind that there are serious and in some respects unique risks associated with nuclear power. All sorts of energy systems are subject to accidents, but no energy systems are subject to trillion-dollar accidents like Chernobyl and Fukushima. No other energy system can give you weapons of mass destruction, whereas there's a long history of peaceful nuclear programs being used as cover for weapons programs. And thirdly, nuclear plants are essentially in situ terrorist targets. And there's a very troubling situation in Ukraine, as I'm sure you're all aware, where there have been a number of attacks on nuclear plants and where the Zaporizhzhia nuclear plant has lost off-site power on at least 8 occasions. And every time it loses off-site power, there's an increased risk of meltdowns and an increased risk of nuclear catastrophe. Now, for the reasons I mentioned a moment ago, we're not going to go through these slides in any detail, but you're very welcome to download them off the web. And instead, I'm just going to conclude with some information on where you can get, firstly, to reiterate that I would encourage people to download this PowerPoint at nuclear.fo.org.au. And more information, we're promoting and building the Don't Nuke the Climate portals, the website, the social media sites. The ACF Power Games report is important. The Friends of the Earth website has got useful information, and I've highlighted there the fact-checking resources that we've put up in the past week. And ACF, Renew Economy, the Electrical Trades Union, I would encourage you to check out all those resources. And thanks very much for listening. And I'll hand it back to you, Scott.
Thanks so much, Jim. I just want to point out before we wrap up there that every single one of those items that Jim just ran through is referenced. So when you download the presentation, you can find the reports and the data to back up each one of those claims. That presentation could easily have gone for an hour. There's so much information. If anything, the difficulty is condensing it down. But I just want to acknowledge how much work has gone into that. And the point that we're facing very severe disinformation, some of it's well-meaning misinformation, some of it's very deliberately targeted disinformation. All we have to combat that, to fight that, and to come back with is the truth. So if you're interested in the facts behind that presentation, all that material is referenced. There's a huge amount of to hear from Wendy Farmer, who's also got a fair bit of information and background to share on this issue. Wendy is the president of Voices of the Valley, which is a community advocacy group that formed during the catastrophic 2014 Hazelwood Brown coal mine fire in Victoria. So that's 10 years ago this year, if you can recall. It burned out of control for 45 days, poisoned more than 70,000 residents across the Latrobe. And during this disaster, the community's health concerns were basically ignored by local, state and federal authorities. So Wendy came together with community members to speak up for the community, and now she's having to do it again. She's working with FOES, Yes to Renewables campaign, but this is very much a grassroots effort. The Latrobe Valley has been nominated, obviously, as one of the sites. Nobody's asked them, but it's been nominated as one of the sites for Dutton's nuclear power reactors. And Wendy, even in the last couple of weeks, has been one of the key drivers bringing these 7 communities together to make sure that people aren't getting played off against each other and to take a stand against these nuclear reactors. Wendy, really grateful to have you on the call with us. Please take it away.
And thanks for having me join today. I want to make it clear that, you know, this announcement was told to communities. Communities weren't consulted. Dutton and his party room are bullies, and that's how they've treated the communities, the 7 regions that he's proposed his nuclear fantasy. They haven't consulted with traditional owners of the lands. Unbelievably, they haven't even consulted with the power station owners or operators or anybody in the regions at all. They've come in and they've made an announcement that they will convert power stations, which has never been done before, into nuclear assets. Power stations that sit within 5 kilometres of homes. Usually, nuclear is 16 kilometres or more away from homes. Our communities across Australia that have hosted power stations have already paid the price in their health, and we won't allow Dutton and his party to actually nuke our communities. With some of the things, you know, when I say Dutton was a bully or Dutton and his party are a bully, without any plans, ideas around nuclear and just a fantasy, he has said, we expect no opposition. Well, the people on the call today, let's make sure that he sees there's lots of opposition. We will tell the community for 2.5 years. We will consult with the community for 2.5 years of the words. But whether they like it or not, we are going to go ahead with our plans. That's not consulting. That's dictation. The communities will have no right to veto. The communities will have no right to object. They will just go ahead with our plans. Well, we'll show them we will not go ahead with the plans. We should actually, everybody on this call should be angry. We should be really angry, but we should use that anger for good. We've seen our traditional lands abused before, and we can't allow that to happen again. Dutton, very early on, I realised that Dutton was going to actually play the regions against each other. Latrobe Valley could come out strong and refuse nuclear, oppose it like he said we wouldn't. But at the same time, I wanted to make sure that the other 6 regions weren't then being sacrificed. It wasn't just about my own region. It was about Australia standing together. That was the reason that I thought we need to actually align the 7 regions. We need to make sure that we give strength to each other. What we have seen already is Dutton come out and start playing the regions. He's gone to different regions. He's gone to WA. He's gone to South Australia and Queensland to say, this is what we're going to do with no plan, just ideas, with experts that aren't experts, people that have been looking at nuclear with no expertise for a year or more, you know, a little bit more, but no real expertise, but with theories, with ideas, just little memes that people will start thinking in their brain and start saying, well, nuclear might be a good thing. Nuclear is not a good thing anywhere. We all know the issues behind nuclear. So the 7 regions need to stand strong together. Dutton has promised cheaper power for industry if we had nuclear. We would look after communities. We would give community benefits. We don't want nuclear, and we don't want his lies. One thing that communities do need is jobs. They need good health, and they need a future. They need to be able to look for a vision. But these communities are already visionary. They have already got transition plans. They are already working on transition plans. The 7 power stations that have been proposed are either already started on renewable energy road, or they're looking at, when they close, what renewable energy will be great for their sites. All 7 regions. Although Dutton and his party have said if they won't hand over their sites, we will walk in and take them. We will acquire them. Compulsory acquisition. It's not okay. We cannot allow this conversation to continue. We need to kick it in the butt, but we need Australians to stand together to make sure that we support each other. There's 7 regions. If you live in any of those regions, work together. Make sure you find the people on the ground to work with them, to support them. We need to take every opportunity to show the coalition that we will not accept nuclear, and we will be out there, the people power. Through the Hazelwood mine fire, while our community was ignored, we spoke up, we continued, and we showed them. We won. We saw our health addressed, but we also saw a power station that had done the right thing, knew that they had an issue, but ignored the issue charge. It was one of the biggest court cases for both WorkSafe and the EPA. It was because community pushed for change, and community got what they wanted. They wanted the truth, but they also wanted a safer region. We need to stand with the regions a little bit. If you've only, often I hear people say, but I don't have time. We actually don't have time not to do it. We have to make sure, even if it's a little bit of time, a lot of time, support the regions, support these campaigns against nuclear, and say we will not accept it. And once again, reach out to your regions. Together, we can make change. We've seen it before. We will make change, but we will do it together. Thank you.
Thank you, Wendy. That was magnificent. That we've just heard 2 stories back to back of the power of frontline grassroots organising. It's not a slogan, it's how these campaigns get won. So if you're far from the impact areas, if where you're joining us this morning is some distance away from those dots on that map that Jim put up on the wall just before, you can back in the people who are on the front line, because the work can't be done without you, Wendy. Thanks so much for taking time out of your schedule to be with us too. While you were talking, Sana has put into the chat one small way that we can make a contribution to the frontline crew today. The petition at nonukes.com.au, that's a collaboration of the 7 targeted communities. So hop into that, sign it, but more importantly, distribute it. Get it to the folk who aren't on the call today. So we're just going to come to our last speaker, then we'll throw to get some focus feedback from people who are on the call. We're up to 120 people, which is just really gratifying. Just a couple of quick shout outs to Caitlin Stranell and Dr. Kome Hosokawa, who've joined us on the call, both very long-term activists and organisers from Japan, just reminding us, as Jim did, the international dimensions of this story. Nuclear technology, nuclear fallout, radiation and waste do not respect national borders, and our movement operates internationally across borders as well. I'd also like to acknowledge on the call today Joe Valentine, who was the first MP elected anywhere on this planet on a platform of nuclear disarmament in 1984, and Giz Watson, who was the longest serving MP for the Greens in Western Australia. Thanks so much for joining us and lending your weight to this work as you've done over such a long period of time. Now, our final speaker this morning, before we throw to Q&A and get a bit of feedback from you folk, is Sana. Sana Desfart works for Don't Nuke the Climate as my colleague, and she's also the Nuclear Free Collective Coordinator at Friends of the Earth Melbourne. She holds a master's degree in Peace and Conflict Studies. She's also had the privilege of walking with traditional owners on their country to learn about why they want to keep uranium in the ground. And Sana's going to give you a bit of an overview of the work that we've been doing on the website. Please take it away.
Thanks, Scott. Thanks, everyone. I just want to acknowledge that I'm calling in from Wurundjeri Woiwurrung country, and want to acknowledge the role that First Nations people have played both in Australia on this continent and abroad in leading the fight against uranium and realizing the importance of opposing uranium and the nuclear chain. Can everybody see that? Did this work? The sharing? Yes. Okay, great. So I'm just going to tell you a little bit about the campaign. So Don't Nuke the Climate started off as a global alliance of different countries in the kind of in the context of COPs, the climate summits happening. And we were working together with people all across the globe to make sure that the dying industry, which is the nuclear industry, that is trying to get a piece of the pie of the renewables transition, was getting a counterweight or counter argument. And so now that Dutton has come out with his nuclear proposals and his push, we thought that we should give the Australian chapter a bit more weight. So we reworked the website. We realized that there's a lot of information out there and it's quite overwhelming. So we thought, with over 4 decades of experience in this area, we compiled all the information that we could find that could be really helpful so that people don't have to start from scratch. They can just go to this website and amplify everything that we do on here. You can also go to any other places to find your information and I guess find out more. And it's so important because there's such a big push that I feel what we're seeing is that it's a similar push that derailed the Voice referendum, and that was played out quite bigly on social media. So it would be good to counter that, and we put all the information together. Try to get to the next slide. Just an overview of the website. We've got information about small nuclear reactors. We've got a myth-busting section and a take action section that you can go to. We put together a newswire. As I said, there's so much news coming out at the moment that it's really hard to wade through, and we've already done a selection for you. So you can go and see the most important articles that are coming up. We've got resources and links. There's some really great reports that have come out recently. And on the right side, you can see the initiatives in your region that have been working in this area for a long time that you can connect to if you want to get more involved. There's some videos on the website as well, and we've also got a YouTube channel that has all those videos, and we invite you to share them widely. There's some really great explainer videos and some other webinars that we've done. Got some memes that you're free to use, and please let us know as well if you've got some great memes that we can share. The myth busting are the questions that we see come up most, and also the arguments, the flawed arguments that are coming up. And this gives you a really good handle on like how to build your counter argument. in whose backyard, metaphorically speaking. So this is a focus on the 7 regions, exactly where they are on the site as well. These red dots are the currently named sites for potential power plants, nuclear power plants, but actually the yellow dots are the other retired or retiring coal stations. So I don't think they're out of the water yet, because if one doesn't go ahead, they can still be targeted. So it's good to keep an eye on that. And here is the different groups that you can see that are standing together and fighting in their own community as well. So you can get in touch with them and the news that is related to those regions. So our call to action. First of all, support the 7 communities. So what Wendy's just been talking about, sign the petition, send messages of support. It can be quite isolating when you're fighting such a big beast in a community. So messages of support are really helpful. Find out more about nuclear on our website. Follow us on the socials, on Insta, Facebook, and on Twitter. And please spread the word as wide as we can. Please share the messages. There's an ACF Info petition that is also on the Take Action tab on our website. And we are planning some specialized sessions like this, but one on health, one on jobs, and any other areas that you would be interested in. So if there's any specific topic that you would like to see that we can get experts in to talk about, please put that in the chat or in the Q&A so that we can talk about that in more detail and invite specialists that are have their expertise in that area, for example, water and farming as well. I just fell off the radar. Train the trainer session. So we were thinking it could be really helpful for people to take Jim's presentation or a version of Jim's presentation and present that in their own community. People seem to take on things more from people they know and trust. So if you do that in your own community house or church community or wherever you have a network, that can be a really good way of starting that conversation and having honest and truthful conversations about what it would entail to have nuclear in your community. And again, the one-on-one conversations. The one-on-one conversations are really powerful. People take on stuff from people that they trust. So have that convo with someone. Write to newspapers. So on our Take Action page, we also have dot points or a link to a guide what you can include in your letters to the local newspaper, when you call into your local radio station, or letters to the editor. And find your local anti-nuclear group. So that's on the resources page. That's it for me. Yeah, thanks everyone, and we'll keep you posted as well. We'll send up a follow-up email with all the links coming out of the chat and all the ideas and a recording of this session.
Perfect. Thank you, Sane. So we've come to the end of the sort of formal part. We've heard from some incredible speakers and people with a lot to share, and we're right at the top of the hour. So we will be taking names of the people who drop off at this point. I'm just kidding, but we're going to throw now to about half an hour for Q&A. The chat has been going a bit bananas while people have been speaking, so we've got a lot to draw on. Before we do, though, and before we lose you, if folk are planning on heading off and creating a ruckus somewhere else, we've got 2 bits of feedback that we would love to hear from you, and those feedback questions are about to pop onto your screen in the form of a quick survey. There it is. The system is working. So we'd love to know 2 things. I mean, we'd like to know 20 things, but these are the 2 that we focused on. What are you hearing in terms of what messages are resonating with people about nuclear energy in your circles? There's people on this call from right around the country. What do you hear? And what's working? What are the arguments that are working as far as you can tell around nuclear energy, either for or against? What's resonating? We'd love to know. And the second one, are there any tactics or strategies that you'd like to see the movement employ to end the threat of nuclear once and for all? And this might be a bit of a once and for all thing. If we bury this push, it'll be a brave politician or a very daft one who would bring it back again, which is why we're throwing so much energy into this. So what's either the tried and true or the completely off the wall, creative, not been done before idea that you would like to see thrown into the mix? That's what we're after. Collectively, and I've just been skimming the guest list while folk have been chatting, there is an enormous amount of expertise on this call. So this is your moment just to throw some thoughts into that poll. And it looks like that's happening. Not a single person has left, which is extremely gratifying. So stick with us for another half an hour, because these giant brains and experienced campaign hands are still with us to take your questions. So while you're filling in that poll, I'm just going to go to our first question, and maybe we'll start big picture. There are a couple of detailed technical questions, but let's start big picture. What politically underlies the coalition's nuclear stance? It's hard to believe they are honestly totally ignorant of climate change. Who would like to take that one on? Dave's unmuted. Go for it.
I might start, but I'm sure other people have lots of views. But like, we've actually heard a bit of chatter from within coalition ranks that there's a lot of people, or quite a few coalition politicians, that are uncomfortable and wish that the boss hadn't gone as hard on nuclear as Peter Dutton has. And that makes good sense. In relation to the drivers, massive driver is to cement fossils and expand gas. Massive driver in this. Another is key members, particularly of the Nationals, have an almost pathological hatred of renewables. They don't, it's very strange. Renewables offer energy security and economic prosperity, particularly in regional Australia. And yet that opportunity is being actively, not just shunned, but actively undermined by this nuclear proposal, and by people like Matt Canavan and others who consistently deride and demonise renewable energy and belittle it, even though it's 40% of Australia's electricity. So I think it's that combination of fossil fuel drivers, political ideology, wanting to wedge Labor, and also looking for something that is sellable as big, bold, new, get you on the front page of The Australian. And it really helps when you've got The Australian and the Murdoch Press and Sky News that will jump on any release saying nuclear is good. Push, not a plan, because there's no details, there's no costings, there's nothing that you could say is a credible plan. A push, a dream, a vision for Australia to go nuclear. I'm sure others might have other views from the panel.
I think
Who else would like to take that on?
Yeah.
Go ahead.
I think sometimes when we look at federal politics these days, it seems like we can't have a bipartisan support for anything in common. We need to go a complete opposite way. One of the things for sure, and I didn't mention when I said, is, regions need the jobs, and nuclear would not give jobs for 40 plus years. It would also increase the price of energy, and we haven't got another 40 years to have energy increase. It will slow down renewables, and that is some of the fact behind what is happening. This is about slowing down renewables, slowing down investment, but in that, we're taking away jobs that already exist. Jobs that are in regions now in renewable energy and are growing and committed already are being destroyed because of this nuclear idea. That's one of the reasons we need to bat it. But, governments actually have been playing with energy for a long time now, and they need to step aside, get out of energy, and let the energy do what energy needs to do.
Magic. Jim, I noticed you unmuted. Did you want to make a comment?
No, I won't, but Sana was going to speak.
No.
Oh, sorry.
It's okay. All right, we'll throw to another one. This one might be a bit more in your wheelhouse, Jim. When we talk about percent share of energy, are we referring only to stationary energy and not including transport energy? Bit technical, but the numbers diverge widely, so it's probably worth clarifying.
Yeah, no, I was talking about contributions to electricity generation. So globally, we're 30% renewables, and that's growing strongly, and 9% for nuclear, and that's falling steadily. But it raises a broader issue that we don't have to just be concerned about electricity. There's the whole stationary energy sector and transport and so on, and a whole lot of challenges there. So, you know, one of the difficulties with this nuclear debate is that it's such a furphy, and it distracts us from a very big, very difficult renewable energy transition that we are undergoing and that we need to undergo. And it's not at all straightforward. It's not going to be as quick as we would like. It's not painless, but it's necessary, and nuclear just complicates it endlessly. And what concerns me with the Dutton Coalition is not so much the nuclear plans per se, because I think they will be knocked on the head sooner or later. For example, if the coalition was to win the next election, well, perhaps it could not get its legislation through the Senate, and that would be the end of the nuclear dreams. But what the coalition can do is derail the renewable energy transition. And even from opposition, the Dutton Coalition is derailing the renewable energy transition by sowing seeds of doubt amongst investors. And that problem will be amplified many times over if the coalition wins the election. So that's what they can do, and that's what they plan to do, and that is immensely troubling.
Yeah, thank you, Jim. That's great. Terrifying, but great. Are the long-term costs of waste storage built into the costings of this industry, or are they left to the community to cover? I'll just observe that mostly this debate has focused on economics, how slow, how it stands relative to the, you know, potentials for keeping coal burners running or renewable energy spinning up in time. Nuclear waste is utterly diabolical and intractable, and obviously there's a huge concern with people being left with that liability. But in the costs that are being quoted for nukes, do they account for waste storage for the next 250,000 years?
Well, some countries have made provisions for decommissioning costs and nuclear waste management costs. I'm not aware of any countries that have made adequate provisions for decommissioning and nuclear waste. And to give a sense of the scale of this problem, there's a US Department of Energy report which estimates that the cost of building a high-level nuclear waste repository and operating it for 100 years would be roughly 150 billion Australian dollars. And that's about the same figure that the South Australian Nuclear Fuel Cycle Royal Commission came up with for long-term management of high-level nuclear waste, 140, 150 billion Australian dollars. So we are talking big bucks, and generally it's not been provisioned for, certainly not by the private sector. So those are costs that will fall on the taxpayer, and those costs will certainly not be factored into the Dutton Coalition's nuclear costings when they're released in the coming weeks or the coming months.
Could I also jump in and add to that, the Australian experience with radioactive waste, low level and intermediate level waste, has been 35 years of division and policy failure. There have been multiple fights at multiple sites, and there has been no agreed, approved or advanced, either full long-term disposal or management plan. So if that's the situation in relation to low and intermediate, low level 300 years of isolation, intermediate 10,000 years of isolation, commercial civil radioactive waste is 100,000 years of isolation, much more complex, much more costly, doesn't give confidence in it. What also doesn't give confidence is that, as Jim said, Peter Dutton has not released any costings. He has released arrant nonsense that it'd be 1 Coke can of waste a year. That is absolutely not the case. And he's also dodged the waste question by saying, well, direct that to Minister Miles, because he's looking at a site for AUKUS waste, which is trying to also do that wedging, which we've spoken about, and also just avoiding, profoundly irresponsibly avoiding a waste management issue, which is profound and proven that it's an issue not proven that it can be resolved anywhere in the world. Not one country in the world has a final disposal site for high-level radioactive waste, not one. The Finns are the closest, but they're still not there. And our sort of key partners, like the AUKUS partners of the US and the UK, the whole thing is in disarray. Massive costs, massive failure, disarray. So there's no confidence at all. At the same time as this, while they're playing politics with radioactive waste and ignoring the reality and not making financial or technical provision, they're also playing banging the drum like Alexander Downer, the longest-serving foreign minister and a significant heavyweight in the coalition, is actively spruiking high-level radioactive waste for Australia. So it's a very dangerous thing. Everything about this nuclear plan from the coalition is a gateway exercise, a thin edge of the wedge exercise. That's why environment groups are so strongly committed to stopping this. One is to stop nuclear threat, and two is to keep, as Jim clearly put, the renewable, essential and happening renewable rollout and the transition away from coal on track. We want to keep the lights on, the alarms off, and the way to do that is stopping radioactive future, building a renewable one.
Oops, brilliant. Thanks, Dave. Here's a bit of a spiky one. All my green friends are pro-nuclear. What can we do to counter this?
Well, share this PowerPoint, share all the resources on the Don't Nuke the Climate website, show them the CSIRO Gen Cost report, the recent report by the Academy of Technological Sciences and Engineering, ATSI. You know, there's no real shortcut. If they think that nuclear power is going to help or solve climate and energy problems, then they just need educating. But I really have to push back against the idea that there's any significant environmental support for nuclear power. It's negligible. In Australia, you could list the pro-nuclear environmentalists on the fingers of one hand, and without naming names, you know, one of those I will call an industry shill. Another one I will call a barking mad conspiracy theorist. So there's precious little environmental support for nuclear power in Australia.
I would also
Wendy or Trish, I wonder if... Oh, sorry,
Yeah.
Dave. We'll come to you. Wendy or Trish, I just wonder, you're mixing in different circles to many of us. I just wonder how you run these arguments with people who might be a bit sceptical or not on side.
Look, even, you know, for people that aren't on side, we need to address the health issues. We need to address the job issues. And we have the technology in Australia today to give us a secure, affordable energy system. We don't need nuclear, so why would we do it? But what about the waste? Where do we put the waste, and why would we leave that for the next generations? We can do better, and we must do better. And I think green people should be thinking that way. We can do better, we must do better.
So Dave, when I first started becoming more aware of nuclear, I was like the majority of people in my community. Like, we didn't know anything. Like, all nuclear stuff, that was other people. But it didn't affect our town, so it didn't really worry us. Then when we had the opportunity and it was about to affect our town, it was like, whoa. And the council actually got out there and they'd done a community meeting, and they'd done just an absolutely brilliant stuff of what they're doing and what will happen. And they walked away after the council meeting, like everybody walked away. Council would have had about 90% support of building the nuclear waste. And then I went out and I got all the information. I educated the community. I then went around and I'd done a door knocking and a survey, and I actually got 96% support. So I was able to swing that around. And not only was I doing it for my community, I was doing it for all the other little communities too that also, like us, didn't know anything about nuclear until I got them to realise nuclear waste trucks would be going through their community, and then it was like, whoa, no, we don't want that. And I think that was the biggest thing, just getting out there and educating people. And I haven't heard of one First Nations person on the New South Wales side that totally support nuclear. However, then it comes back down to money, and a lot of people are going, oh yes, well, all right, then we'll take the money. And so we just have to be very, very careful of that and really educate people.
Thanks heaps. Thank you, Trish. Thank you, Wendy. Dave?
Yeah, I think, you know, the good news about the nuclear debate is that there's a sense in the community and a growing understanding that business as usual is not possible and we need to change the way we make energy. The bad news is that it could distract us and undermine the real solution. I think a lot of people are canvassing nuclear for a couple of reasons. One, because it's never been canvassed in Australia, so it's a new, well, it has, but this is recent and significant. And so people are going, well, let's have a look at it. And that's not an unreasonable thing. The other thing is that people are increasingly aware of how pressing and how grave climate impacts are on species biodiversity, on human life, on agricultural production, on so much. And people are desperate. And there's a sense of, well, you know, throw the piano overboard because the boat's sinking. Well, if our energy choices were nuclear or coal, nuclear or fossils, then there's a hard discussion and some hard decisions. But we are blessed. And I think that's one of the things that we really need to stress. Nuclear is not on the same level as renewables anywhere in the world. Nuclear is under 10%, renewables is punching at 1/3 of the world's power. In Australia, nuclear is nothing. It is slow, expensive, the most expensive, and it's illegal. It would take 20 years at least, as Jim said, and renewables today are 40%. So we're 40%, you know, Bon Jovi, we're halfway there, doing it with sun and air. Like, we are 40% there. Don't change horses midstream to something that is toxic, high cost, high risk, deadly slow, and will mean that we don't address climate change, the thing that's opening people to have a look at nuclear. It's a false solution. It's a delay and distract and derail program from the coalition, and we need to be really clear about putting forward the evidence and putting forward the solutions. The evidence is that nuclear is too slow and too dear, and the solution is that renewables, responsible, but swiftly adopted, is the way to go.
Beautiful. So I'm noticing some of our WA comrades are about to drop off the call because there is an anti-AUKUS meeting popping up. So there's a couple of queries in the chat about AUKUS and the nuclear dimensions of AUKUS. So let's come to that while those folk are still with us. Can someone address the issue of Dutton's neat wedge of the Labor Party? They're accepting that it's okay to have nuclear reactors in submarines, but not on land. AUKUS is one of the major betrayals which the Albanese government has served up. Shameful. Who would like to address that question? Mostly our calls focused on the nuclear power push, but you can't ignore that side of things. So who wants to have a crack at that?
I feel I've spoken a lot, but this is one that ACF has spoken on. AUKUS is a grave disappointment, and it's a dangerous proposal. It was made in highly political circumstances, and it's exactly the model that Peter Dutton is trying to use for this, like a sudden announcement, a big polemic, whereas this one, Labor has said, no, we're not going down the domestic nuclear power, we'll fight you, make this a referendum on nuclear power. On AUKUS, it was before an election. It was highly politicised. It came out of nowhere. Albanese, opposition leader then, Albanese, was given a day, less than, to come on board or not, was terrified of being pinned to the wall in the Conservative media as soft on defence, and made a decision to go boots and all into AUKUS. Now, many hoped that they would walk away from that in government when they had access to the full costs, the full consequences, the risks, the regional concerns. Unfortunately, they haven't done that. They have increased and advanced this, and it is a real worry, and it is a point of real tension and a wedge that the coalition are really pushing. I think what we need to remember is a couple of things. One is when AUKUS was announced, then Prime Minister Scott Morrison said that this has nothing to do with a commercial or civil nuclear industry in Australia, that the two are not related, and this does not foreshadow or require an Australian nuclear industry. That's now been flipped, and it's now like, oh, well, we've got these reactors on subs, so why don't we have them on land? And surely if it's safe enough for subs, it's safe enough for our land. And, you know, if we're going to have high-level waste from submarines, then we should have high-level waste from the world. So they are, again, gateway pushing. So AUKUS is a mistake. It won't make us safer. It won't make us healthier. It locks us into a whole range of international threats. But the other thing is it brings high-level waste and a whole range of radioactive threats to our communities, our port communities, our waters. But that does not mean, like, one bad decision does not mean that you're locked into life to make increasingly poor decisions as a result. AUKUS was a mistake. The Labor Party should walk back from AUKUS. There should be elevated responsibility and transparency about all things to do with our defence arrangements, particularly if there's a nuclear dimension. But it is not a justification. It's strict politics to play the game that the coalition is doing.
Seems fairly straightforward. Brilliant. Dave, thank you. Jim?
Yeah, I'll jump in there. Just firstly, to reiterate a point that Dave's made, the coalition government and now the Labor government say that AUKUS can proceed without a domestic nuclear power industry. But now the coalition opposition says that there's a national security imperative to drop the legal ban preventing nuclear power because of the whole AUKUS project. So they've flipped on a dime. And there's some really troubling stuff coming out of a speech that Ted O'Brien, the Shadow Energy Minister, gave a couple of nights ago. It was in Adelaide at the Institute of Public Affairs seminar. IPA is one of those far-right think tanks. And he was floating not only nuclear power reactors, but also a whole suite of nuclear fuel cycle activities to be introduced to Australia, such as uranium enrichment and fuel fabrication. But what really got me worried about the way he framed that argument was that he said that it's a strategic imperative for Australia to have a whole suite of nuclear fuel cycle activities. Now, exactly what he means by that is people can make your own judgments, but there's only one reading I can give to that, which is that he's opening up this whole spectre of Australia having a latent nuclear weapons capability. I think that's the way I would read it. I'm sure that others would read it that way. I'm not sure exactly what explanation Ted O'Brien would give for his use of the word strategic, but we are going down this path again. Whether we like it or not, nuclear fuel cycle activities, whether it's power or enrichment or so on, do introduce a latent weapons capability. And Australia's only serious push for weapons 50 years ago was underpinned by a hidden weapons agenda, as the then Prime Minister John Gorton acknowledged. So I just want to flag those issues. We don't have time to delve into them, but we do need to consider this weapons dimension to the whole nuclear debate.
Awesome, Jim. Thank you. Trish, did you unmute before? Just wondering if you wanted to catch that one as well, and then we're going to wrap the session. No? All righty. In that case,
No,
we're
I
good.
didn't.
Oh, go ahead. All right.
No, I didn't
dramas.
unmute yet.
You're right. So more than half of the participants have filled out one or both of the questions in our little questionnaire about what are you hearing and what do you think is worth a try, and really grateful for that. We're going to close that in a couple of minutes. Thank you for everybody who joined us this morning. It's a bit of a chunk of time out of the Saturday. There's folk heading for other meetings. Hopefully there's folk heading for other things. Just really appreciate that you joined us. In terms of what's coming up, there were a whole heap of ideas that have been pitched and proposed during the course of the call. Get in touch with us if you'd like to do a workshop with Jim on the Train the Trainer. So if you're interested in being able to give a version of that presentation in your community, that's certainly available. We're also planning on hosting one of these calls roughly once a month, where we would address particular areas of concern, whether they be health costs, occupational health and safety, or hearing from people from each of the 7 communities who are impacted and on the front line. And so please just stay with us, follow our socials so that we can stay in touch with you. And the most important thing is spread the word. Probably the most important thing you can do if you're on this call is reach out to people who aren't. That's how movements are built, and that's how we're going to beat this thing. So I'm just going to make sure that there was no other homework for me. Go and check out the website that Sana just demoed. Look up the actions page there. There's the RAD show on 3CR. There's the 7 communities petition to sign. There's the ACF petition. There's a lot of reading. So please reach out to your communities, lend a hand. We can absolutely beat this and take it off the agenda once and for all. But more than anything else, thanks so much for joining us today. And to all the speakers and all the expertise and experience that you bring to this thing, it's just really gratefully appreciated.